Hello all you beautiful Dungeoneers, as always I am Cosmic, and today we're going to be reviewing a little indie dungeon crawler called Dungeon Rushers, which was developed and published by Goblin Studios. I've always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with dungeon crawlers because you can get ones that are just completely enthralling and enticing, like the likes of Darkest Dungeon, which last year's installment was just amazing and it was just gripping and you just wanted to play it again and again and again. And then you also get dungeon crawlers that are repetitive, boring, and lay by the wayside. Now, Dungeon Rushers is a indie installment into the genre, and essentially the story is a little bit of a piss take, so to speak. It's filled with humor. It's supposed to basically take a little bit of fun out of traditional dungeon crawler and RPG tropes. It starts off with a boy known as Elon, who is essentially fed up with being the local toilet cleaner, and he decides that he wants to be a dungeon crawler and become, rich and famous, etc., etc. And so the story starts where Elon is going through the game's first dungeon by going through, and essentially his actual first weapon is his toilet brush. And the game is basically filled with that kind of humour. It's filled with a little bit of funny here and there. It is all text-based, there is no voiceover work, and it does do a pretty good job of portraying that humour in a fairly well standard, and the writing itself is fairly good. It's got a little bit of problems here and there, but overall, as an indie title goes, it's fairly standard and solid. The way Dungeons Rushers works in terms of its dungeons is a very standard system. It is a tile-based system, and your party is represented by an icon, and you click on the next tile to move to the next room. Now, in Dungeon Rushers, you cannot see the next room unless you've used an ability, and you cannot see how big or large the dungeon is. Instead, you just have to guess your way through as and where you go. Dungeons themselves outside of combat are filled with traps that you can disarm using abilities that are specific for traps. Party members also have dungeon abilities that essentially do different things depending on the characters. For example, Elon's is one where you can reveal two tiles either way, so you can open up and see what's ahead of you. And then you also have, like I say, the trap abilities, which help you to disarm traps. All of these abilities cost stamina. Now, in dungeons and in combat, stamina, health and mana do not regenerate. You can use health, stamina and mana potions to recoup the lost resource, but you cannot regenerate them at any point during the dungeon itself. And so if your character dies, they are not coming back until you've either left or cleared the dungeon. The dungeon layouts out themselves are fairly randomly generated in certain aspects. You do get some that are pre-made. There is also a multiplayer aspect to the game in the sense that you can create your own dungeon for other people to play, and other people can create their own dungeons. And the dungeon builder is fairly simple and easy to use, and it does a fairly nice job of being able to create some player generated content. Once you're into combat, the combat itself works in a very traditional RPG turn-based system. Essentially, you work from an initiative ladder, and as you go down the ladder, each character takes their turn. There is also a positioning system, so you have people at the front and people at the back, and it works as thus. So, for example, if your character is one at the front and you have one character behind them, the character from behind can only be attacked with range abilities, and you can only melee that character once the frontliner is dead. Players of the genre and of RPGs and turn-based games in general will be right at home here. Each of your characters has 3 abilities that you unlock as you progress, and each ability does a various thing depending on what the character is and what kind of weapon they're holding. The combat doesn't hold a great amount of depth compared to that of, say, Darkest Dungeon, but there is a fair amount there, and as indie titles go, it's a solid system that is executed very well. The combat can also be challenging as you progress, so it does keep a nice difficulty curve. I think the only major issue I have with the combat is that it does get a little bit repetitive, a little bit monotonous, and overall it just can feel later on in the game like you're doing the same thing over and over and over. for very little reward. Because once you've actually unlocked the 5 characters that you can have in your party, that's it. That's what there is to the game. There is no, big, follower character system where you can swap in and out. There's just 5 characters, and you go through those characters, each having 3 abilities. And once that's all done, and you've used all those abilities, and you know the combinations, and then you know the enemy types, because there's not a massive, varied amount of enemies themselves, it does get very, very repetitive. And I have to say, this is a problem that the game has throughout its core design, is that it's not just combat that gets repetitive, the entire game gets repetitive. There's no real end game goal here, because once you've unlocked all the characters, and you've unlocked all their abilities, there's nothing really for you to unlock. Yes, there is a loot system that you can upgrade just character stats, but again, for what purpose? Because once you've unlocked all the characters, you're pretty much done. Like, there's nothing really keeping you going, keeping you entertained in that sense. It's very repetitive from that point on. And I think that, sure, it does provide a good value for money in terms of entertainment value as you're progressing, as you're going through, the first, 75% of the game. It's not bad, it's worth it. But ultimately, it does fall into the tragic problems of the genre that many other games fall into, in that it has no real end game goal. It doesn't really hold a player well after a certain point, and ultimately, because of the limitations of combat, the limitations of its dungeoneering, the limitations of the fact that it is an indie dungeon crawler, it ultimately shoots itself in the foot as you progress. The game works really well graphically, it runs really smoothly. They employ a pixel art style, which I'm not a massive fan of. The last 5 years, there's just been a massive phase of pixel art that has just bored me to death. But for the most part here, I have to say I was pretty impressed with the quality of the pixel art. And ultimately, it does, especially certain characters, it does kind of give me a nostalgic feel of a more traditional JRPG experience. I think overall, Goblin Studios have done a really good job with this. It is a nice little indie dungeon crawler. I think if you're looking to cure that dungeon crawler itch with something new, then by all means get this game. It is certainly going to cure that itch. I like to think of this game like a sandwich. It is going to sort you out for lunch, but you wouldn't want it for a diet, and it's that kind of thing. It's good for a short time. You're going to enjoy yourself, get your entertainment value out of it if you want something that is a traditional dungeon crawler, and then ultimately it's not something that is going to sustain you long term. And that is my review of Dungeon Rushers. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. As always, before you leave, please like and subscribe, and as always, I will see you next time.